All right, everybody, welcome back. Ready to jump into another deep dive.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Today, we're tackling something that I think is on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah.
Corporate climate action.
Yeah.
It's everywhere you look, right?
You got it.
Every company seems to be talking about going green and sustainability,
Yeah.
but how much of it is really making a difference?
Right.
We're going to try to cut through the noise today,
Absolutely.
see what's actually happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And to help us with this little deep dive, we're taking inspiration from Masood Khan.
Okay.
He's got this fantastic podcast, Sustainability Rewired, and really, as the name suggests, tries to make these conversations, interesting,
Yeah.
engaging,
Right. Yeah.
not just, a lecture on doom and gloom.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're going to be drawing on some of the insights from his podcast and kind of putting our own spin on things.
Sounds good.
And he really breaks down some really interesting stuff, like setting these science-based targets,
Right.
aiming for things like carbon neutrality and net zero, which we hear everywhere now.
Yes.
Disclosing climate risks.
Huge.
This idea of internal carbon pricing.
Yeah.
And then even engaging employees in these initiatives.
Very important.
So a lot to unpack there. But I think, it's easy to get lost in the jargon, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I'm really curious about, and maybe we can start here, is why now?
Okay. Sure.
Why are we seeing this sudden surge in corporate, climate action? I mean, it's not like companies just woke up one morning and decided to save the planet. So what's driving this change?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It's definitely not just a sudden change of heart. I think a lot of it is there's a lot of pressure coming from different directions, right?
Okay.
You've got investors, they're starting to really pay attention to environmental, social, and governance factors.
ESG.
ESG, right?
Right.
Exactly. So they're looking at a company's environmental impact really closely before they decide to invest.
Okay.
And then you've got consumers, right? They're becoming more and more aware of the environmental impact of their purchases.
So they're voting with their wallets.
Yeah, absolutely. They want to buy from companies that align with their values.
Right.
And then on top of all of that, you've got regulations. Governments are starting to implement stricter environmental policies, and companies are kind of having to adapt.
Right. So it's like they don't really have a choice anymore.
Right. In a lot of ways, no. It's becoming a necessity to stay competitive, to attract investors, to appeal to consumers.
So it's not just like a PR stunt.
It's definitely more than that.
It's becoming like a core part of how businesses operate,
Exactly.
which is, I think, a good thing. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's dig into some of these specific actions then,
Okay.
because I think it's important to understand what they actually mean in practice.
Right.
So let's start with something that sounds very technical. Science-based targets.
Right.
What does it even mean?
Yeah, it does sound a little jargony, doesn't it?
It does.
But it's actually pretty straightforward. Basically, it means that companies are setting emissions reduction targets that are in line with what scientists say is necessary to prevent the worst impacts of climate change.
So they're not just plucking numbers out of thin air.
No, not at all. They're using actual scientific data to guide their goals. And a lot of them are using this framework. It's called the Science-Based Targets Initiative.
Okay.
And it helps them figure out, okay, what do we actually need to do our part in keeping global warming below that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold?
Which is the big goal, right?
Yeah, that's the goal that scientists have set to avoid those really catastrophic impacts of climate change.
So it's really about being precise and showing that they're serious about reducing their impact.
Exactly. It's about accountability.
Okay, so that's science-based targets. Now let's talk about these buzzwords that we hear everywhere. Carbon neutrality versus net zero.
Right.
They're often used interchangeably, but is there a difference?
There is. There's a subtle but important difference. Okay.
So carbon neutrality is basically like balancing your carbon checkbook.
Yeah.
You reduce your emissions as much as you can, and then for any remaining emissions, you invest in projects that remove an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Okay.
Things like planting trees, investing in renewable energy projects, that kind of thing.
So you're offsetting what you can't reduce.
Exactly. Net zero is a bit more ambitious. It's about completely eliminating greenhouse gas emissions, or at least reducing them to the point where any remaining emissions are absorbed by natural systems like forests or oceans.
So net zero is like aiming for a zero balance in your carbon checkbook.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You're not adding to the problem anymore.
Right. Okay. So it's like next level carbon neutrality.
All right, that makes sense. So we've talked about setting targets. We've talked about neutrality versus net zero.
Yeah.
What about climate risk disclosure? Because this one seems like it could be a little bit touchy, right?
It can be. It's basically companies being more transparent about the potential risks that climate change poses to their business.
So, like, admitting that climate change could actually hurt their bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. And this is becoming increasingly important because investors want to know, hey, are you actually prepared for the impacts of climate change?
So are there specific things that they're disclosing, or is it kind of like a general, yeah, climate change is a risk?
It's becoming a lot more specific. There's a task force. It's called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD.
Hmm.
And they've developed these recommendations for how companies should be disclosing these risks.
So is it like mandatory for companies to disclose this information?
It's not mandatory everywhere yet. Some countries are starting to make it a requirement, but a lot of companies are doing it voluntarily because they see the value in it.
Okay, so it's about being honest, being transparent,
Mm,
even if it means, admitting that they're not perfect.
exactly.
Okay, so that's climate risk disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's talk about the one that, I'll be honest, makes my head spin a little bit. Internal carbon pricing.
Right.
What is that?
So basically, it's like putting a price tag on carbon emissions within a company.
Really?
Yeah. So it's like an internal tax or a fee that they apply to their own operations based on how much carbon they're emitting.
So why would a company do that to themselves?
Because it creates an economic incentive for them to reduce their emissions. So if they know that emitting carbon is going to cost them money, they're more likely to invest in energy efficiency, renewable energy, things like that, to lower their emissions and save money.
So it's kind of like a self-imposed penalty
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
to encourage them to clean up their act. That's fascinating. So how do they even decide on a price for their carbon emissions?
Yeah, that's a big question. And there are a few different approaches. Some companies, they look at what a carbon tax might be in the future,
Okay.
and they use that as a benchmark. Others, they might tie it to existing carbon markets or government regulations.
So there's not like a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, it really depends on the company and their specific circumstances.
Yeah, so that's internal carbon pricing.
Eh.
And finally, let's talk about employee engagement.
Oh.
Because this one is interesting to me because it seems like companies are finally realizing that their employees can be a powerful force for change.
Absolutely. And I think for a long time, companies saw sustainability as something that was kind of separate from their employees.
Okay.
But now they're realizing that engaging employees is not just the right thing to do, it's also good for business.
Okay.
Because when employees are engaged, when they feel like they're part of the solution, they're more motivated, they're more productive, they're more likely to stick around.
So what are some of the ways that companies are actually engaging their employees in these initiatives?
All sorts of ways. Some companies, they're creating these internal green teams
Okay.
where employees can volunteer their time to work on sustainability projects.
Like within the company.
Yeah, within the company.
Right.
Others are organizing volunteer days, getting employees out into the community to plant trees, clean up parks, things like that.
So it's not just about what they're doing within the company, but also kind of like extending it outwards.
Exactly. And some companies are even giving employees a say in the company's overall sustainability strategy.
Wow. That's amazing. So they're really giving employees a seat at the table.
Yeah, they're recognizing that their employees have valuable insights and ideas, and they want to tap into that.
I love that. So it seems like companies are starting to, walk the walk when it comes to climate action. It's not just about, empty promises anymore.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a shift. We're seeing more and more companies take real concrete action to reduce their impact, and that's really encouraging.
It is. It's encouraging, but it also kind of makes you wonder, what's next?
Right.
What happens after companies have implemented these actions? What are the long-term implications?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I think we're only just starting to understand. We've talked about the what of corporate climate action, but the why is just as important.
The why.
Yeah, the motivations behind these actions, the effectiveness of different approaches, the challenges and opportunities they face, that's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
That it is.
All right.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. A lot to think about, a lot to unpack. But as
Right.
always, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.